One love, y'all. Wanted to make a video talking about consciousness, the parameters of consciousness, the reality boxes or frames of reference that the culture that we lives in has produced, and how that relates to what we call, abnormal or anomalous or supernatural, psychic stuff like this. So I wanted to read a little bit from this book here, Reality Boxes by Ingo Swann. And in chapter 33 here, the title is Measuring the Parameters of Consciousness. Okay. So he says here, if consciousness is bigger than we think, a number of interesting and somewhat complicated questions arise. Perhaps the first of these things hinges on comparing 1. What people do experience of consciousness with 2. The presumed bigger whole of it which they do not experience. This comparison is difficult to undertake because people are not aware of what they don't experience, simply because they have never become aware of it. For example, one cannot become aware of consciousness aspects they have not become aware of. The whole of this might first seem as a tumbling play of words, but the fact is that if individuals do not experience awareness of this or that aspect of consciousness, then such aspects simply do not exist for them. But there are 2 other facts that need to be acknowledged. First, people everywhere in all times and situations have to get along within the context of what they have achieved awareness of. And, second, what they have achieved awareness of will be used to define or circumscribe not only what consciousness is, but what its parameters are or must be. Obviously, such definitions of consciousness cannot include circumscription of whatever they have not achieved awareness of, and which hence cannot be included in definitions of consciousness. By far and large, people are not aware of what they are not aware of. Furthermore, what they are not aware of is not experienced as an absence or even as a nothing. Okay, so, you don't know what you don't know, right? So if you haven't experienced a certain aspect of consciousness your whole life, it's not like you're going to feel like something's missing, right? If the culture that you're in has developed a certain definition and description of what is included in consciousness, the things outside of that definition, you're not gonna you're not gonna feel like you're lacking of those things. They're just not gonna exist to you at all. So this is what I was kind of touching on in one of my last videos, where I'm saying you gotta have these experiences in order to widen your frame of reference. People can discuss, intellectuals can discuss these kind of things, and science can look at the situations and different scenarios and talk about them. But until any type of experiencing happens, it's just kind of like, it's like a little game you're playing with your own intellect, right? So I just wanted to read another part here from page 157. Some examples of this are the Terang people of Africa, whose environment is the Great Sahara Desert, have traditionally taken the measure of some 12 kinds of wind and the many kinds of sand. They have thereby assigned names and working frames of reference for them, for which there are no equivalents in English. Likewise, the older Eskimo cultures have taken the measure of at least 17 kinds of snow and their implications. In cultures traditionally dependent on camels as modes of transportation, an extensive list of different kinds of those beasts, plus the vagaries of camel attitudes, have been available. Again, in older oceanic cultures of the Polynesian islanders, many different kinds of ocean waves were identified, along with, most importantly, their probable portents. In cultures that need not be intimately familiar with subtle differences of wind, sand, snow, camels, and ocean waves, all winds are generally and simply seen as wind, sand is sand, and so forth. Right? So we live in a culture where it's very materially based. Materialism what they call the scientific thought. So in our type of culture, you know, it's this is the kind of consciousness is just consciousness. That's kind of the generalization. We don't pay attention to the subtle different types of consciousness states, and so we don't really even have names. We have no way to communicate these things. So, when they don't exist, you can't you can't communicate them. You can't develop them. You can't become aware of them and build sensitivity. So our culture is mostly based on building insensitivities to things, right? So a lack of the greater portion of our consciousness, we're insensitive to that, right? So that's why there's kind of like this big resistance in the scientific community when it comes to what they call extrasensory perception, clairvoyance, remote viewing, right? You're trying to introduce something into the reality box of consciousness of that culture that isn't accepted, because it's going to require a reworking of the current definition. So there's always going to be this kind of resistance, especially in the Western culture and the more materially based scientific, intellectual circles. So it's important to stop worrying so much about what everyone else thinks about these kind of subjects. What you really need to focus on is having these experiences for yourself. The more individuals that have these experiences will be the more accepted that these phenomenon and these greater aspects of awareness can be included in our current definitions or reality box of consciousness. Otherwise, all these things will always be on the fringe, right? They'll always be laughed at, ridiculed, scoffed at. So just wanted to share that little tidbit there. Sand is not sand. Wind is not just wind. There's very subtle differences in those aspects that mean different, that give different results, signal different things. And the same is with consciousness. Consciousness is not just awake or asleep, or however you want to generalize it. There's many subtle faculties, many subtle things that are within that whole generalization of consciousness, and we need to work on identifying them, experiencing them, identifying them, and nurturing and unfolding them. So hopefully that was interesting. Check out my website. It's back up now, www.thefeedbackloop.info. The link will be in the description. There's a target pool there, informational videos, as well as some session work. So hopefully that was interesting. One love, y'all.